Hey, Tylin, would you watch the waiting room while I work on that poll really quickly?
Well, hello, everyone. Really good to see you. If you are of a mind to come on camera, it would be great to see you, but I will leave that to you. It's odd because we have 100% of you not on camera, which is very disconcerting.
But what if we look really haggard?
Yeah, I'm gonna go, hi, Lori.
Hi.
I'm gonna do my screen share thing anyway, so let's
Okay.
see. Yeah, I'll be doing that in just a hot
Not
minute.
on.
So I'll wait till we're on. Thanks for
I'll come
being
say
great.
hi quickly too.
Okay, thank you. Hi.
Shamed me.
All right, yay, look at us. Oh, that's great. It's just so much easier to teach a class when I can see you. It's hard enough doing it on Zoom. So thank you. All right. We're going to start with a poll. Now, let's see. Shelby, is the poll in chat? Oh, there we go. So let's do the poll real quick. I hope it works. Oh, it's working. Okay. So, this is interesting. So there's not a ton of experience with lobbying in our group, but there's a good understanding of the difference between advocacy and lobbying. That's great. So thank you for participating in that. You have in your chat a link to a worksheet. If you want to pull that up for use during this session, that might be helpful to you. So what I'd like to ask you to do is just starting with that worksheet, spend a minute as we get going thinking about what you would like to learn today, like what specific questions you have, and just do that quietly. Okay. Does anybody have does anyone have anything specific you want to learn that you'd like to share? Either chat or out loud.
Yeah, so Ryan here, Liz.
Yep.
We're fortunate to be on the governor's budget under long range planning. for infrastructure. And, I guess my question would be is, from when the governor's budget comes out, what sort of timeline are we looking at? And, what kind of things need to happen from the organization's standpoint? Now, we're in a really special situation where the state owns the buildings that our nonprofit is in. And so we're just trying to get some upgrades done and advocate for that.
Okay, so your question is related to the current governor's budget
Correct.
and timeline. Okay. Anybody else have specific things you're interested in? So Ryan, that falls a little bit out of the advocacy and lobbying. If you are in the current budget, you should be fine because that budget is in effect until June 30th. It's the new budget.
Yeah, it's the new budget, the one that just came out.
Okay, got it. Okay, well, all right, so that's good. So we will cover some of that. Anybody else have anything in particular? Thank you.
I'm here more from a development standpoint, just trying to get an idea of the difference between advocacy and lobbying so I can talk to funders about it and putting together advocacy related proposals for foundations and that kind of thing.
Super, you're spot on. Anybody else?
Yeah, along those lines, I'm with Montana Audubon and I've done our lobbying for a few sessions, but we dabble a little more in federal work now, and I know there's been those changes in actually reporting, and I feel pretty versed at reporting for state level, but I am concerned or just want to make sure we're doing all the reporting we need to at the federal level. But then along some of the same communications lines is we have a new development director coming in and helping them understand those differences as well. And you sometimes hear that like, well, it's hard to fundraise for advocacy. And I'm like, these people care about these issues, but it's like how you talk about it. So yeah, they're learning that piece. But I think for me is a little bit concerned about making sure we are federally tracking things. And I'd even be happy if someone had a resource to recommend to like present to our group, like on a small level or something.
Okay, great. So a resource for tracking expenditures? Okay.
Yeah, and I know, I would say because I haven't done as much federal, having someone that can help us just make a nice spreadsheet of like, this is the grassroots education, this can go in as education, this is lobbying because it's preparing to talk on XYZ.
Okay.
Really kind of coming up with a nice black and white list that I can help guide staff with.
Okay, great. Anything else? All right, well, let's jump in. We have a lot to cover, and okay, let's see if I can get in slideshow mode for you. Oh, there. Okay, somebody give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Okay, thanks. All right. So here's our agenda. We're going to first run through some definitions, and then we are going to talk about lobbying and the IRS and reporting, legal parameters for lobbying state elected officials, the role of COPP, and elements of an advocacy plan. I will tell you that the bottom of the list is elements of an advocacy plan. That is like its whole own course. We covered a little bit last time, we'll cover a little bit this time, and then we'll cover a little bit next time. But it really is, creating an advocacy plan is a whole, it's a whole curriculum all by itself. But I think it's worth talking a little bit about that. So last time we met, we went through this kind of advocacy cycle where you identify the challenges, define your solutions, all of that. Then this time, so if I go back, the last space here is advocating for change. So that's the space we're paying attention to today, is this advocating for change. And So advocacy is a whole bunch of things, including lobbying, but not all lobbying is advocacy. So one of the thoughts I want to start with is that, you know how in fundraising, the ask is like a tiny part of the whole cycle of fundraising. Having a bill in play is a tiny part of the whole cycle of advocacy. So there's a whole bunch that happens around advocacy that isn't lobbying. And I think it's important to understand that then there's some very specific regulatory requirements around lobbying itself. Advocacy, you can do a ton of. So just to set the frame for today's conversation, we will be talking about 501c3 nonprofits. Now, there are other nonprofits like 501c4s that are really organized for the purpose, often for the purpose of lobbying. 501c3s, you sometimes hear it's not legal for nonprofits to lobby. If lobbying is a substantial part of your activity, you can get in trouble with the IRS. And so we're going to cover that, what substantial means. And that will get some to the question of federal reporting and expenditures. We'll also, before we talk about that though, we'll be talking about advocacy. What is advocacy? What's advocacy related to legislation and advocacy that is not related to legislation? And then just so you know, we're focused really on 501c3, but we will talk just a little bit about the difference between 501c3s and 501c4s. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about what advocacy is in general. And when you think about like a lot of times if we're involved in human services work or things like that, we think about advocacy and it's, we're advocating for clients or things like that. So this is, we are focused on advocacy more related to public policy and changes in public policy. There is a ton of stuff nonprofits can do that never falls into the realm of lobbying. And I think it's important for boards to understand this because sometimes boards' comfort level with lobbying is not really there. So let's talk about some of what can happen with advocacy. So a large number of activities, everything from grassroots to education to research, lobbying, all of that is advocacy. Anything you do that increases the voice and visibility of your cause or your mission or the people you serve falls into that understanding of what advocacy is. One of the things we'll be talking a little bit about today is where activism falls. Activism gets a bad rap sometimes, the protests and the marches and things like that. If we think about the spectrum of advocacy, and with this definition of anything that helps elevate the voice of the organization, so just from the perspective of the power differential, if I can't, get attention, or the point is to have influence over the public policy process. So I have to evaluate what's going to give me influence at what points along the way. If I cannot be effective testifying as a lobbyist, or if I cannot be effective, and I'm using black and white binary terms, and I think it's more of a yes and, but if I cannot get what I need as far as attention and raising voice and visibility, sitting across the table from a legislator, that's when organizations and people begin to think about activism, which is more along the lines of the public, standing by the Capitol with signs asking people to honk. Maybe it's protests or things like that where, we may think, well, how is that related to advocacy? It's on a spectrum. And I think for each of us to be aware of the role of power in effective advocacy is important. I'm going to talk about this for just a minute. So I run an association, number one. I'm a white woman, number two. I'm on the COVID task force, number three. I was on the Coronavirus Relief Fund task force. So I have standing. I have the ability to, bring some power in the current culture into a conversation. I need to be aware of that and aware, especially as association leader, of who doesn't have that standing and what is my responsibility in representing voice for organizations that don't have that same standing. So I think as we think about the range of activities that become advocacy, it's important to understand that individuals are coming from their own experience and sometimes are keenly aware that this kind of advocacy that I might find more appealing to me might not fit for who that person is and the standing they experience in the policymaking process. So that is a bit of a statement, and I wonder if there are any questions about that. The textbooks on policy and advocacy, some go into community organizing and protesting and all of that. Many of them talk about how you work in the legislative system, but working in the system, it doesn't always work for everyone, and it's just important to realize that. Then that's why there's a real range, okay? All right. So advocacy when there's not a bill. None of this is going to be hugely surprising to you, but these are the kinds of activities that organizations can undertake when there isn't a bill. And I think it's good for you to have a handle on it because as you build your plan, there will be some of these things that become part of it that aren't necessarily lobbying or that you can do at any time, regardless of whether there's legislation. And it's really important. So we talked about this 2 weeks ago about becoming a resource to legislators. To the degree that you are an expert in your area, that is something that legislators rely on. And sometimes we've interviewed legislators about what's important to them. They need your expertise because they don't have time to research all of it. So the more you can lay things out, not from an opinion basis, but from the data basis or the full story basis, like here's the story of how it actually works. That isn't always data. Then you can be that resource. Then inviting policymakers to community discussions and things like that. Again, they are getting they want to represent. That's why they're policymakers, or, we have that assumption they want to represent, and they want to get reelected. And so you're providing them a venue for hearing directly from constituents about issues of the day can be a really powerful role you play as ambassadors and leaders in the community and kind of trusted sources of information. Many of us have done this, inviting policymakers to our site. The congressional schedule is posted, and this is more around federal, but in August there's always recess. And right now it's great because of Zoom. It is not that hard to get a policymaker to attend a meeting, whether that's a board meeting or a meeting with constituents. and that includes at the federal level, you know, being able to get our members of our congressional delegation in front of our audience. I'm not saying it's easy, but it takes work and planning, but it's not as impossible kind of as kind of pre-Zoom, where it's really threading the needle to get somebody to do a roundtable discussion or a town hall kind of thing. And then, you know, especially when you have a relationship, or if you are in a legislator's district, you're contacting that individual and giving them some feedback on issues of the day. Again, it kind of just helps fill out the picture for them. And because you're in their district, you get more attention. Op-eds are great, and op-eds are also great for thank yous. You know, legislators, regardless of what side you're on, people love being thanked in person. And so finding ways to incorporate thanks into op-eds, or just to give a really poignant perspective on an issue. In Montana especially, maybe everywhere, but in Montana, people aren't necessarily reading the New York Times. They're reading the Standard, or the Independent Record, or they're reading the Miles City Star. You know, so they're reading the weeklies and things like that. And often those smaller newspapers are looking for an inroad, or they're looking for news, and so you can get things published in them. Asking legislators or officials to clarify their position on issues, that is not lobbying, and it's not advocacy on a bill. And then this whole thing of submitting comments on regs is really important. There's, after the legislative session, there's this point in time where the administrative rules are being redrafted or revised to reflect what happened in the legislative session. You really want to track that for any bills that you were following or advocating on or lobbying on. Is that rule, the regulatory part of it, when it becomes rule, things can get easier or harder through the regulatory process. And so paying attention to that is not considered lobbying, and it's an important part of the role. Okay. Then these are different ways that when there is a bill, things you can do that are not considered lobbying. So this is all about defining the difference between lobbying and advocacy. All of these fall into advocacy. So what I'm going to do is give you, rather than read these to you, I'm going to give you a minute just to look at them, and then we'll see if there are any questions. Okay, any questions on any of those?
This is Amy, real quick.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to answer it right now, but it's making me wonder about some of like different confirmation and heads of agencies and how you work on that. And that can be either a question for later or now, whatever you think.
It's if somebody has the, if somebody has the ability, if it's a policymaker, first of all, there are specific regulations around members of government participating in lobbying. And so if I go to the Department of Revenue and I'm working with the head of the Department of Revenue and saying, this needs to not happen, they're not allowed to lobby. They can come into a hearing and provide information, but they are not policymakers. And so when you work, and that's why it says communicating with these different branches, when you communicate with them, that's not the same as lobbying. So we're going to get into the definition of lobbying, and I think that'll clarify. But if there are issues that don't refer to a specific piece of legislation that you're talking about with a policymaker, talking about those issues, and when you stop short of asking them to vote a certain way or support a certain legislation, you're advocating, you're not lobbying. Omitting the call to action, which is what I just said, providing a strong opinion on a piece of legislation, but you stop short of saying, please don't support that or please do support that, you are advocating, not lobbying. If you publish something, and I believe this is a gray area, I'm not sure I completely agree with this one, but if you publish in an e-news, for example, to your constituents, here's a piece of legislation we're thinking about. These legislators support it. These legislators don't support it. If it's during a run for office, that can become an endorsement message. So you have to be really careful. But if there's no campaign going, it's not an endorsement message, and you can say that all day long, okay? You're just informing people. If you distributing a nonpartisan analysis of a legislative proposal, an organization that does a really good job of this is the Center on Budget and Policy. They are just a really excellent resource for legislators because they come with analysis. They come with that kind of data-driven approach. Let's see, providing assistance to a legislative committee after a written request. I don't really know what the after a written request means, but there are legislative committees that happen all the time, and during the legislature and after. And so providing information to help them understand their role in working with potential legislation or legislation that's been passed is not considered lobbying. Self-defense lobbying. Now, I have not heard this discussed except for in terms of foundations. Foundations generally aren't allowed to lobby unless it's self-defense. So if there is a potential rule or bill that's going in that would threaten the existence of foundations in some way or threaten some fundamental aspect of their work, they could lobby and not get in trouble because it would be called self-defense. Also, lobbying as private citizens and not as representatives of the organization. So this is where, like if you're not paid, if you are a board member, you can participate, and it's not lobbying in the sense of a lobbying expenditure that needs to be reported, okay? Now, if there are expenses related to it, such as travel expenses and things like that, and we will deal with that in just a moment about what those might be, okay? So all of these are examples of lobbying when there is a bill. Excuse me, advocacy when there is a bill. So I want to look at my notes really quickly. I think that's what I want to say about that. So now I'm going to talk about lobbying, and I want to come back to the big screen because it's sometimes hard just to only have a little square view. Okay, so lobbying involves four things, really. Three. I mean, we typically think of it as three things. There's a bill at play, either a bill that exists or a potential bill. There is a policymaker, somebody able to influence that bill, and it could be a staff person or a policy person, and you actually make a request. Please do not support it. Please do support it. You can do that in testimony. You can do it through a written request. You can do it in a meeting in their office. If there's a bill in play and somebody able to influence it, and you are specifically lobbying that they either support it or don't, you make the request, that's lobbying. It's that simple. Everything else is advocacy. That's direct lobbying. Now, there is an element of lobby that's called grassroots, and that's when you communicate with your constituents and say, there's a bill in play, please contact your XYZ and ask them to oppose it or ask them to support it. Now, they could contact their person and say, hey, here's how this would impact me, and stop short of making the request. So they're not actually lobbying. That doesn't matter in terms of your activity in asking them to lobby. Your activity in the grassroots arena is considered by the IRS, it's considered lobbying. It's called grassroots lobbying. We're going to talk quite a bit about what that is. But lobbying is that simple. You have a bill, you have somebody who can influence the outcome of it, and you're making a request of them. Okay? Or you're asking your constituents to. That's grassroots lobbying. Everything else is advocacy. A note about avoiding partisan activity. This is only an issue during campaign season. If someone's running, you have to be really careful about lobbying during that time, or certain kinds of advocacy during that time. So this is where if you publish a piece for your constituents and say, this candidate, this issue is important to us. Let's just pick on public lands. Public lands is important to us, and this candidate does not support public lands. That gets into endorsement. It's not lobbying, but you're kind of implicitly endorsing a candidate. You can't do that. Now, you could have a candidate forum and invite candidates of all kinds to the forum. You'd want to invite the major candidates and say, where are you on public lands, and let them talk about it. You're not endorsing. And that's not an endorsement. So I'm not going to go very far down that road because we just finished with an election, and who wants to go backwards in time for the love of all things sacred? But just know that sometimes lobbying can move into what we would call electioneering, because you end up endorsing a candidate accidentally. Okay. So what I'd like to ask you to do now is take your worksheet and for just a moment, respond to what your organization might be likely to engage in as far as lobbying and advocacy. Are you interested in lobbying? Are you interested in advocacy? Or are you interested in both? And then the next question would be, what are some logical ways for you to build your advocacy voice even when there isn't a bill in play? So spend just a minute on that focus on advocacy. And then we're going to get into the legal compliance. Okay, Shelby, I think what I'd like to do for 5 minutes is just put us into breakout rooms to discuss that question of how can we strengthen our advocacy voice?
Perfect. How many folks would you like in a room?
Just two breakouts. So the question in the breakout is like, how might you, like what specific thing comes to mind as we talk about advocacy and the menu of options? Something specific, like name the legislator, name the newly elected person that you may want to do something with, okay? So we'll go into the rooms for just a few minutes.
All right, you guys will be your screens will change and you'll be popped into a different room. Hey. It's going great. Just spilled water all over everything.
Oh, okay, get up to vote. All right. We're going to get into the compliance stuff, and it's just so much more technical.
Yeah, but it's good. I think, people are, it's a good session. And that's when I'll share the 501H.
Yep. Let me see what I asked you to do. It was the 501H and yeah, the form. And then permissible activities. We may skip that. We're going to run out of time. Okay, why don't we give him another minute? It's not very long to be in, but
So at 11:39, I'll close the room and then they'll have 60 seconds to come back in. Does that work?
okay, sounds good.
Or I can do it right now and they'll have 60 seconds from now.
Did you see Mary's note about the session tomorrow?
Well, awesome. Take a look and make a worksheet that we can share, but I think we'll be good.
Okay. Okay, instructions. Hey, Shelby.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah.
Could you find, while we're doing this, could you find the instructions for completing the 990? I didn't send you that link.
From the IRS.
Yeah, I can find it here among my Word documents if I need to. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move into compliance. Does anyone have any feedback before we do from that discussion on in terms of next steps with advocacy? All right, well, buckle up because we're going to go into compliance now. So there are two, we're going to start with the lobbying and the IRS. Let me go back to my screen share. Okay, here's our definitions. So you'll get this PowerPoint, it has the definitions in it. All right. Compliance with the IRS. So there are, the IRS says that 501c3s cannot spend a substantial amount of their time and energy and resources on lobbying. So what the heck is substantial? Because there's been so much confusion around that, the IRS in their wisdom said, well, you can either kind of think in substantial as being a certain percentage, and it's like maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 6% of your operating budget that you could spend on lobbying. And remembering that lobbying is a very discrete, set of activities. And so advocacy, you can do that all day long and you don't have to report on it. For the IRS, you have to report on lobbying expenditures. And we're going to get to what those are when we look at the 990 instructions. Okay, they're pretty clear. So because substantial is a relative word, the IRS invented something that's actually super helpful. It's called a 501H election. And I want it just by a raise of hands. Who's familiar with a 501H election? Oh, I love it when this happens. Okay, some of you are, but some of you aren't. So we are going to look at the 501H election. In your chat box, there's a publication it's 5768. If you just pop that open, this is a 501H election. Look at how much information you have to provide to the IRS to get this election. It's amazing to me. So it's less than half a page. And once you have this, you just fill it out, you send it in, and once you have it for life, unless you undo it. What the 501H election does is gives you a mathematical formula for measuring your expenditures. And I think I did not give that to Shelby. So let me find it it'll just take me a second to find it, and I'll open it up and share it with you, okay?
What document was that?
It's one I didn't give you. It's the measuring lobbying and expenditures. I've got it though. So I'm going to share my screen and show it to you. Oh, I'll share it in the chat so you can see it directly. Sorry, I have to find it. Here it is. So this is a formula the IRS gives you if you file a 501H. If you have a 501H election status, you use this mathematical formula that you see on the screen to figure out how much you can lobby without being penalized. Penalized meaning you pay an excise tax. So if you lobby if you have more than this expenditures, you'd pay an excise tax on it. Okay? You don't need to know what these amounts are, but what's important to know is that there is a mathematical formula, and it includes not only your direct lobbying expenditures, but your grassroots lobbying, and there are two different formulas. And so some organizations that exist, to do a lot of lobbying or grassroots lobbying, if they exist for that reason, sometimes it makes sense for them to become a 501c4. And there are differences between 501c3 and 501c4s. Shelby, have you got that link? Sorry, I think I've got it here. I've got it. So we can compare what 501c3s and 501c4s do, and so you can see that sometimes it makes sense for an organization to go ahead and set up a 501c4. Once again, I'm searching for it. Here it is. Okay. So here's 501c3s can do certain things. 501c3s are limited in lobbying, 501c4s are unlimited. Okay? With the 501c3, if you educate a candidate, you have to offer that information to all candidates. With 501c4s, you can pick candidates, and so that's not an issue. So if you rent out mailing lists, you have to allow any candidates as a 501c3. You just can't show any preference for candidates. You cannot compare candidates on issues of importance to the organization if you are a 501c3. If you're a 501c4, you can. You can't endorse. So most of the difference is around electioneering. Somebody had a question about get out the vote. Get out the vote is not considered electioneering. Sometimes there are threats on that. In the last legislative session, there was a bill that would have created an incredible regulatory burden for nonprofits that do get out the vote. That bill did not go anywhere, but that's in Montana. Get out the vote is part of the democracy, you know, and so that would be considered electioneering is a little hard to swallow. Actually, we just don't. We just are not going to swallow that because get out the vote is so fundamental to civic engagement and the way we work in our country. So, but it can be politicized, as we know. All right. So what's important for you to know about lobbying expenditures is that there is a mathematical formula with the 501H election. With that, you still have to track your expenditures, and you report it on your 990. So every nonprofit, as you know, fills out a 990 once a year. Whether you have a 501H election or whether you use a substantial test, like no more than 5% or something like that, you have to track your expenditures. So there's an instruction form for completing the 990. And do you want me to find that, Shelby? The nice thing about that instruction form is that it goes into all the definitions of expenditures. So in your chat box, you have a link to the 990 instruction. And if you open that up, whoops, that is not exactly what I was looking for. One moment. I gave Shelby the wrong directions. Hold on. So these are actually instructions for completing Schedule C, which is the part of the 990 that deals with lobbying. And I'm going to show them to you. Mainly so you know kind of that they exist. You don't need to memorize them or anything like that. It's just important to know where to find them. Here we go. So this is where we get into the expenditure test. You see that there, and how to figure out what your expenditures are. What I'm interested in showing you is this section on lobbying expenditures. Okay, so it goes into, first of all, definitions, and then there is a specific section on expenditures and what qualifies as an expenditure. So you can use this. Here's some examples of direct contact lobbying, phone, all of that. So you can use this 990, Section C of the 990 or Part C of the 990 to guide you through tracking expenditures. And somebody asked about a form for tracking, and this is not that, but I think we can find one. And so if you, so for example, if you are lobbying, any time you're spending on lobbying is an expenditure. Any mileage associated with that is an expenditure. Any print associated with that. So if you print an e-news and you, that becomes a lobbying expenditure from the federal perspective. Now from the state, so that's the IRS. There's substantial and substantial or expenditure. You use one of those, you fill out your 990, and you have to report that. The state reporting system, I think, is more complex and also in some ways simpler. First of all, the Commissioner of Political Practices is the body that regulates state lobbying. So that's where you go to find everything related to state lobbying. And you can find, like if you're going to have $2,600, in 2019, the limit was $2,600. If you're going to have $2,600 in lobbying expenditures, paying for a lobbyist, you have to register as a lobbyist. It's like $150, okay? And you register through the Commissioner of Political Practice's office. If you're going to hire a lobbyist, but you're not one, you register as a principal. If you also are a lobbyist, so for example at MNA, because I lobby, I register as a principal because we have a government relations person we work with and pay, and I also register as a lobbyist. Okay, I register as both. And then you have to, the important thing really is the reporting requirements. Once you register, the commissioner's office is super good at notifying you about when those reports are due. It's really important to fill them out timely because it's $50 a day for every day late. So it is a massive fine from my perspective if you are late filing your reports with the commissioner's office. I want to go to the commissioner's website, and I feel like I'm going back and forth a lot, but it's not possible in an hour to teach you everything about lobbying, but if you are like super impressed with a website, I know you'll go back to it. So I'm going to take you to the commissioner's website as soon as I find it. And I'm going to show and tell it a little bit. Okay. So this is the Montana Commissioner of Political Practices, and it's got a great citizens guide for how to get involved. Do you see here where it says 2021 lobbying guide? That does not exist yet. It's not a hot link, and I looked in several places and it's referred to, but it's not hot yet. It will be. There's a 2019 lobbying guide that is hot, and it tells you everything you need to know about filing. Here is the lobbying FAQs. So, for example, one I was pretty interested in was, do grassroots lobbying activities need to be reported on your lobby spending reports? Generally, no. Now, at the federal level, they do. At the state level, they don't. Also, at the federal level, all your lobbying expenditures need to be reported. At the state level, it's only in regard to the state legislative process. So the Commissioner of Political Practices is not interested in whether you have lobbying expenditures related to flying to Washington, D.C. They are only interested in your state lobbying expenditures which relate to the legislature and the bill-making process at the legislature. Okay? IRS, it's everything. So there are differences between state and federal. I want to get involved with lobbying. Do I need to register? Somebody who's paid a total less than $2,650, it looks like it's up from $2,600 to $2,650 in 2021, does not need to register, or if they're an individual acting solely on their own behalf or not paid, which means your board members do not need to register as lobbyists. But if you are paid or will be paid more than $2,650, you do need to, or if you're a principal that will spend more than $2,650. So I hope that this is impressive because it's very clear, and it's a great website if you're geeky at all about lobbying. Plus it has great information for constituents to be involved. Okay. I think that's probably as far as we're going to get. So we'll need to pick up with the advocacy plan the next time we meet, and I'll give you a little bit of a show and tell on what will be part of that advocacy plan, and then I want another minute before we move on. Okay, so this is the compliance with Montana statute. That'll be in your PowerPoint. Maintaining compliance, filing as a lobbyist, filing as a principal. See, we covered all this. I just didn't have the screen in front of you. Then here are elements of an advocacy work plan that we'll talk about. What is your big goal? What are you trying to do? And what do you want the outcome of that to be? So you're trying to pass a piece of legislation or get a piece of legislation on the radar because we want to reduce cancer rates. We want to increase funding for early childhood, whatever the long-term outcome is. Then your plan is going to have short-term goals. Those are those bite-sized pieces. An advocacy plan can be years long. And maybe this year you have some short-term goals. It will have your key messages, your elements of messaging. So how are you going to message? And then advocacy tactics. And there are a ton of advocacy tactics. So I'm not even going to go all the way down this list. I just want you to know kind of like what will be covered in the advocacy plan section. Okay, we covered a lot. So the link before this 991. Amy, did you get a link that opened?
Yeah, I was screwing it up for some reason. Thank you.
Okay, you got it. Okay. So, so what we covered then is the difference between advocacy and lobbying, your organization's kind of appetite for advocacy, how to stay in legal compliance with the IRS as you think about lobbying, and then how to stay in legal compliance with the state of Montana as you think about lobbying. They are very different. The IRS resources include the 990 Part C instructions, which really goes into expenditures. And then the Commissioner of Political Practices website is an outstanding resource for activity at the state level. Ryan, the government budget timeline, right now is when you need to be paying attention to what's in the budget and what the new governor is going to propose and where the new governor is with your cause. And so getting in touch with how, you're going to, after Friday, we'll know who the House and Senate leadership are. And so at that point, you'll have an avenue for who to approach in the legislature about your cause. And, as far as the timeline goes, we don't know yet what's going to happen with the session. By the next time we meet, we'll know the timeline. We'll know their calendar. So that will help a little bit. So as far as the complexity of your question, if you want to reach out to me this week, and I'll see if I can get a little more understanding of what you're asking, maybe I can bring some resources. Then we had a question about the expenditures and a spreadsheet that can help track expenditures. I'll see what I can find on that. It makes sense that there would be one. It's more about just knowing what expenditures are and using your accounting system to track them. So if you use QuickBooks or something like that. So I'll do a little bit of research on that and see if I can get a tool to you. Okay. Whew. It's noon. And it feels like we just flew through, a 6-week curriculum. So any burning questions before we go, or you can reach out to me at lmoore@mtnonprofit.org. It's probably my favorite topic. Well, I really like board governance too, but reach out to me. And any comments? Okay. Well, talk to you soon. By this time next week, I think we'll have a lot more information about the session. Okay?
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
Liz.
Thank you. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.